Hey guys, and welcome to the video. This is a two-part series that I've recorded, really breaking down the 12 key fundamental differences as I see them in residential property versus commercial property. It's really important that if you're a property investor or wherever you're at in your journey, that you understand the potential and the upside that commercial property offers. Clearly at HCO, our focus is on commercial property and commercial property development. And what I like about commercial property is that there's really no cap. You can take it as far as you want. You can really push it as hard as you want. And the ability to really unlock value in the commercial property market is just untapped. So in this video, what I talk about is the differences between the two so that you can understand them. Because really commercial property, there's a lot of opportunity in this space. So I hope you enjoyed the video. Let's get stuck into it.
My name is Michael Timmins and I run a company called HCO, which is a real estate business that's primary focus is delivering health and wellbeing centres called Maybloom. Maybloom's purpose is to inspire people to move and live positively every day. We believe in the powerful effect that exercise, positive choices and social interaction can have in helping people to prioritise their health. I have nothing to sell you, I'm simply here to share the journey and bring you along for the ride. Getting started with the first difference is all about understanding the difference between usage. So with residential property, the usage is to accommodate and allow people to reside in the property. But when it comes to commercial property, it's all about business use. It's all about operational use. So some of the usages are going to come down to retail, commercial, industrial, aged care, and the like, hotels. And understanding that as a starting point is really important. So residential is all about accommodation, and it can be short-term or long-term accommodation, whereas commercial is more about long-term with business and operations attached to it. Now the second difference is the leasing timeframes when it comes to residential and commercial. So more often than not, when it comes to residential property, you've got short-term accommodation, which is generally under 28 days, and you've got longer-term accommodation, which is normally sort of a lease to a residential tenant that might last for 6 or 12 months, and it's normally reviewed every 6 to 12 months. Or the lease just might roll over to a month-to-month basis. But there's not normally a lot of strength in those sorts of leases because your tenant could give you 30 or 60 days notice and move out of the property. So as an investor, you're sort of stuck there holding the property, having to pay for those holding costs while you wait for a new tenant to come through. But with commercial property, the leases tend to be for a much longer period of time. So a business that's looking to take up a new lease in an area is more likely to spend the time and the due diligence choosing the right property for their business. And then once they've chosen the property, they're going to spend and invest money on their fit out, moving their staff across, or setting up their business in that new location, and then having to invest their time and efforts into educating the market that the fact that this is their new location in that particular area. So they're building a client base, they're building a customer base, and it's not something that they're typically just going to walk away from on a short-term basis. So what you'll find is that businesses that are looking to take up commercial leases, they're going to want to stay for a fixed period of time. So it might be a first term of 3 years or 5 years or 10 years. In some instances, we've done deals where the first term is 20 years. So we know that we've got one tenant for the next 20 years, and then they've got options to stay even longer than that after the first term. So that's how commercial property lease is normally structured, is that there's a first term and then there's further options on top of that, which might be, say, another 5 years and then another 5 years, and they've got to notify the landlord that they're taking up their option or not. But on the opposite side of that, there's also longer vacancy periods because there's not as many businesses out there as there are residential tenants. So what you'll find is that commercial properties can stay vacant for longer periods of time than compared to a residential property, but there's also an opportunity in that as a commercial property investor. Because once a tenant's left a commercial property, most investors are not looking at that as an opportunity, they're actually looking at that as a weakness because there's no guaranteed or fixed income coming through from the property. So if you're able to find an opportunity where there's some value add opportunities. You know, you can get in there, you can fix up the property, you can reposition it or repurpose it to a different use. So you might take something that was appropriate for, say, a commercial office, and then you convert it into medical, and then you go and attract a medical tenant. Well, all of a sudden you've added a lot of value to that property, because now you've been able to attract a good quality tenant who's prepared to stay for a long period of time, and you've now got that income coming through from the lease. Or you can potentially put it on the market and sell it, because it's now got a lease in place, and it's going to be far more attractive to a new purchaser. Now, hopefully you're getting a little bit of value out of this already. If you are, make sure you hit the like and put a comment in the section below. I'd love to hear what you think about this. But moving on to number 3, the third difference between residential and commercial property is really how commercial property gets valued. Now, on a residential basis, what we're talking about is comparable sales to houses that are the same in that particular area. So what does a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom, 2-car property like for like sell for in the area? That's typically how residential property is going to get valued. But when we're talking about commercial, we're actually talking about the rents, and then we're talking about how that then gets totaled by the capitalisation rate. So when we talk about capitalisation rate, you may have heard the term cap rate, so CAP, or yield. Yield is really what an investor is prepared to pay for the property as a percentage on the asset value. The cap rate works very similarly to that, but it's something that's used by valuers more generally. So the valuer is always trying to get to a capitalised terminal value, right? So what's the capitalised terminal value of this particular asset? So what the valuer will do is, let's say for instance we're talking about an industrial warehouse. The valuer is going to go around that area where we're talking about this particular property and find out what other industrial warehouses have been selling for, and what was the net income that was coming through on that property when it's sold. And what they'll do then is establish the cap rate for that particular property, that type of graded property in this particular area. So let's say for instance we've got a property that's bringing in $100,000, so it might be a large warehouse, and the valuer establishes that there's a 6% cap rate on these types of properties in the area. What we then do is, once we've established what the cap rate is in the area, we take whatever the income is that's coming through from the property. So if there's a lease in place, we take that income, and let's say it's $100,000 in this case. So we put $100,000 into our calculator. We then hit the divide button and put in 0.06 as a percentage. That then gives us a valuation of 1.66 million. Right, so what we're saying is that if the income that's coming through from the property is this, or it's expected to be this once we've leased it out, if it's vacant, divided by the cap rate gives us a value of $1.666 million. Now that's a very easy way for you to be able to work out your own calculations on what properties should cost or what you should pay for them if you're out there looking to buy. Now, what I'm going to show you that's really interesting is how you can quickly get a lot of value uplift and a lot of cash flow, net cash flow, and income uplift when we get to point number 11, right? So make sure you watch till the end, because when I go through point number 11, I'm going to show you how you can quickly boost these values. So the fourth difference is the WALE. Now the WALE is an abbreviation for weighted average lease expiry. And what that means is that on properties where there's multiple tenancies and multiple different spaces, it basically is an equation which gives an incoming purchaser or a valuer an idea of what the weighted average lease expiry is across the property. So for instance, if you've got 5 tenancies that are all on different terms, so one might be finishing up in 2 years, there might be another one finishing up in 7 years, and they're different sizes of the building, it takes those sizes and into proportion of the total area of the building and gives us an idea as to how much expected income there is over a set period of time time to give us some idea of what is the risk associated to this property. So how long have we got until we need to start marketing for a new tenant? So understanding what the WALE is on any property is quite important, because that's going to feed into your valuation, but it's also going to feed into any type of resale price as well. So what you'll find is that a lot of commercial properties will actually come onto the market for purchase if the WALE is getting quite low, because that particular landlord might actually not be wanting to hold on to the asset or take the risk of having to renew those leases or find new tenants. But that again is an opportunity for an incoming purchaser. Okay, so when we're looking at the fifth difference, we're actually talking about comparable rents. So one of the big differences between residential and commercial is that with residential property, more often than not, the value of that property is determined by what other properties like it have been selling in the area. With commercial property, it gets a little bit more complicated than that. So rather than being able to find a commercial property that's similar and what that's sold for, the value or a sale price for a commercial property is generally underpinned by the lease, and the lease is generally underpinned by what the square metre rate is for the rental per square metre. So when we're looking at a vacant commercial property, for instance, and we're trying to determine what the value of that commercial property might be, we would be looking at other commercial properties in the area that have a similar usage and might have a similar type of quality to the one that we're looking at, and we're trying to determine, well, what is the comparable rent that a commercial tenant is paying in a similar property? So for instance, if we've got a vacant commercial property which we're looking at, which might be retail, and it's 150 square metres of ground floor, and we're trying to work out what that might be worth or what we could achieve as a lease, well, we would be looking for other similar retail commercial properties that already have leases, and we would then be taking the rent that's coming through from that property, dividing it by the area. So if we work out that tenants in that area are prepared to pay $500 per square metre for rent, well then we would be applying that $500 per square metre for rent across the 150 square metres, which would then give us our rental approximate amount. The sixth difference is outgoings. So with residential property, normally the outgoings are actually borne by the landlord. So for things like taxes, land tax, council rates, water rates, those are costs that are not usually passed on to the tenant. But in a commercial setting, those are costs that would be passed on to the tenant. So when you're out there marketing for a new tenant to take a lease in your commercial property, you'll actually have to provide a document which is called a disclosure document. And the disclosure document lists out what all of the extra outgoings are on top of the net rental amount that they are looking to pay for a lease. So as landlords, we're wanting to pass on as much of the cost as possible to the tenant within reason, such that we can then have a net passing rent, which is equivalent to basically whatever the lease is that's in place. So there might be a few things that we need to pay for, like land tax, if it can't be passed on under the Retail Leases Act. There might be some small management costs that we're paying to our property manager that may not be passed on, but in some cases they are. So more often than not, we're trying to pass on as much of the outgoings to the tenant as possible, because for them, it's a tax deduction against their business and it's a cost of doing business in that particular location. Now, when I'm talking about number 7, I'm talking about ESG. ESG is environmental social governance. Now, you may or may not have heard of this term before. If you have, you'll know what I'm talking about, but if you haven't, it really comes down to how well the property can perform from an environmental sustainability perspective, but also who sits behind the property, who owns it, what sort of contributions do they make socially, and how well does the property stack up from a ESG perspective. So what's starting to happen is that tenants are becoming far more aware of the carbon footprints that these properties have, the ability to save on running costs, so how well they perform in an energy rating capacity, how much it's going to cost them to have the lights on and running the AC and all of those sorts of things. So tenants are far more switched on to this now. So what becomes important is that if you're looking at older buildings, or you're looking at B or C or secondary class buildings, you need to be aware that you may not be able to achieve the same rents as what a new property or a refurbished property that is achieving a high level of ESG can attract. So that would then need to be priced into the purchase price or the rents that you're looking to attract from a commercial tenant. So if you don't understand what ESG is, I encourage you to go out and research it and understand how it impacts property and property values and lease values, because it is something that's emerging, and it is going to be something that becomes far more popular and far more necessary for you to be thinking about as a landlord.
That brings us to the end of the first part of this series. So we really just stepped through the first 7 key differences, and now we're going to be talking about number 8 to 12. I hope that you got some value out of that. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to click the link and hit the subscribe button while you're at it, and watch through to the next video.